My name is Blair, 34 years old, and a forensic accountant who spends every day tracking hidden money and buried secrets. But the biggest fraud I ever uncovered was sitting right next to me in a leather chair. My older sister forced me to take a DNA test during our late father's will reading, fully expecting to prove I was a worthless mistake who did not deserve a single cent. Instead, when the lawyer opened the envelope, he did not even look at me. He turned slowly to my stepmother, asked one quiet question, and 40 years of carefully constructed lies collapsed in exactly 40 seconds. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever watched a toxic relative dig their own grave and fall right in. The mahogany walls of Lawyer Mitchell's office felt suffocating that Tuesday morning. Outside, the Seattle rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, perfectly matching the gloomy tension inside the room. It had barely been a week since we buried my father. I was sitting perfectly straight, gripping my coffee cup, while my stepmother Diane sat across from me, draped in black designer fabrics and clutching a tissue she had not used once. Next to her was my older sister Vanessa. Vanessa was 39, dripping in diamonds and radiating the kind of smug arrogance that only comes from a lifetime of being the golden child. Her husband Donovan, a sharp real estate attorney, sat quietly in the corner reviewing some documents on his phone. He was a hard-working black man who had always seemed a bit out of place in my stepmother's pretentious country club-obsessed world. Before Mr. Mitchell could even clear his throat to begin reading the estate documents, Vanessa reached into her oversized designer bag. She slammed a crisp white folder onto the polished wood table and slid it aggressively toward me. The bold letters on the front read, "Paternity DNA Results. Go ahead and sign the inheritance waiver." "Blair," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You and I both know Mom was right all along. You are nothing but a mistake your mother pawned off on our dad. You do not have a drop of his blood in your veins, and I am not letting a worthless orphan steal half of my family fortune." Diane nodded solemnly, placing a comforting hand on Vanessa's arm. "It is for the best, Blair," Diane murmured, faking a sympathetic sigh. "Your father always suspected you were not his. We just want to respect his true legacy and protect the family assets." I did not flinch. I did not yell. In my line of work, you learn that numbers and science do not lie, but desperate people do. I simply slid the folder over to Mr. Mitchell and nodded. "Please, Mr. Mitchell, read it out loud for the room. I want everyone to hear the truth about Dad's legacy." The old lawyer adjusted his glasses, his face completely unreadable as he broke the seal. He pulled out the thick packet of lab results. The room went dead silent. You could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mitchell scanned the first page. Then he flipped to the second page. His brow furrowed. He stopped reading. He did not look at me. He did not look at Vanessa. He slowly lowered the paper and turned his piercing gaze directly onto Diane. "Diane," Mr. Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Would you care to explain why the lab results confirm that Blair is a 99.9% genetic match to the deceased, while your daughter Vanessa shows a 0% match?" The air vanished from the room. Vanessa's smug smile froze, then melted into sheer panic. She let out a confused, high-pitched gasp and grabbed the table edge. Diane's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The expensive leather handbag slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a loud thud. In the corner of the room, Donovan's head snapped up from his phone. His eyes locked onto his wife, a flash of realization hitting him like a freight train. He had just co-signed a massive mortgage extension based entirely on Vanessa's impending inheritance from her biological father. A father who, as of 40 seconds ago, was not her father at all. The absolute silence in the office was deafening as Diane opened her mouth, but no words came out. The truth was finally out. She was trapped by her own twisted game. Everything they built was crumbling fast. I watched their entire world burn and I felt absolutely nothing. The silence shattered the moment Diane found her voice. It started as a low scoff and quickly escalated into a frantic, high-pitched shriek. "This is a mistake," she yelled, slamming her manicured hands onto the table. "That test is completely flawed. Or better yet, you forged it. You work in finance, Blair. You probably paid someone at the lab to switch the samples just to ruin my daughter." I sat perfectly still, letting her burn through her oxygen. Mr. Mitchell simply adjusted his glasses and looked at her with pity. "Diane, I personally escorted the medical staff to take the samples. There was no tampering." Vanessa was hyperventilating now, clutching her diamond necklace like it was a life preserver. "But Dad loved me," she stammered, tears ruining her perfectly applied makeup. "He always told me I was his favorite. How could he not be my father?" Diane shot her a warning glare, a silent command to shut up. Then she reached into her oversized bag again, her hands shaking so violently she dropped a tube of lipstick. She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper covered in a messy, barely legible signature. "It does not matter what your stupid little test says," Diane hissed, her eyes narrowing as she shoved the paper across the desk to Mr. Mitchell. "My husband knew he was dying. He knew what kind of greedy, ungrateful person you are, Blair. He signed this medical power of attorney 2 days before he passed. He was completely lucid. And in his final moments, he verbally directed me to ensure you receive absolutely nothing. He wanted Vanessa to have the entire estate, and as his medical proxy, I have the legal right to enforce his final wishes." Mr. Mitchell picked up the paper, examining it with a deep frown. "Diane, this is highly irregular. A medical proxy makes healthcare decisions, not estate alterations, especially not verbal ones made under heavy morphine." But Diane was not listening. She was busy trying to rewrite reality, a tactic she had used my entire life. That was when Donovan finally stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He was a man who usually kept his composure, but right now the veins in his neck were bulging. He ignored Diane and walked straight over to Vanessa, his voice dangerously low. "Vanessa, look at me. If you are not his biological daughter, then the trust fund you showed the bank last month does not exist. Does it?" Vanessa shrank back into her chair, her lips trembling. "Donnie, please, I can explain. We needed the cash for the renovation," and Mom said. She stopped, realizing what she had just confessed. Donovan ran a hand over his face, letting out a harsh, humorless laugh. He looked at Diane, then back at his wife. "You used a fabricated trust fund as collateral for a $2 million mortgage extension on our house. That is mortgage fraud. You committed federal wire fraud, and you tied my professional name to it. Do you realize I could lose my law license over your lies?" Diane tried to intervene, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, Donovan, do not be so dramatic. We will sort out the paperwork later. The estate has plenty of liquid assets once we kick this interloper out." She turned her venomous gaze back to me, her mask of the grieving widow completely gone. She looked like a cornered animal. "Get out!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger toward the heavy oak doors. "Get out of this office right now. You are not family. You have never been family. I will drag you through probate court for the next 10 years before I let you see a single dime of my husband's money." I slowly stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. I did not raise my voice or stoop to her level of hysteria. I simply looked at Donovan, who was staring at his wife like she was a stranger, and then I looked at Diane. "You are right about one thing, Diane," I said calmly. "I am not your family. And as for probate court, I highly recommend you hire a better criminal defense attorney than the estate lawyers you are currently using. You are going to need one." I picked up my coat, grabbed my umbrella, and walked toward the heavy wooden door. Behind me, Diane was screaming at Mr. Mitchell to shred the DNA results, while Donovan was demanding the keys to his car from Vanessa. I stepped out into the heavy Seattle rain, the crisp, cool air hitting my face. They thought kicking me out of the office was a victory. They thought they could still control the narrative with a piece of crumpled paper and loud voices. The drive back to my childhood home usually took 20 minutes. But today the Seattle traffic dragged the journey out for nearly an hour. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing through the explosive events at the lawyer's office. I did not care about the money or the estate right now. I only wanted one thing. Before my biological mother passed away, she left me a small wooden jewelry box. It contained nothing of monetary value, just a few silver rings and faded photographs. It was the only physical connection I had left to her. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the sprawling brick colonial house and threw my car into park. That was when I saw it. A massive green industrial dumpster was parked right in front of the three-car garage. I stepped out of the rain-soaked driveway and walked toward the rusted metal bin. My heart pounded against my ribs. Piled inside the dumpster were familiar items: my winter coats, my childhood textbooks, the framed college diploma I had left in my old bedroom, and my collection of vintage vinyl records. They had completely cleared out my room. I scrambled up the side of the dumpster, frantically digging through the trash bags and discarded boxes. I was desperately searching for the carved wooden box. My hands were covered in grime and cold rainwater, but I could not stop. I had to find it. "Well, look who decided to show up for trash day." The mocking voice cut through the sound of the falling rain. I turned around and saw Vanessa standing on the covered mahogany porch. She was wearing an expensive silk robe and holding a crystal champagne flute filled with an orange mimosa. She looked incredibly pleased with herself, completely unbothered by the fact that her husband had just left her at the lawyer's office. I climbed down from the dumpster and marched up the brick front steps. "Where is my mother's jewelry box, Vanessa?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "I do not care about the rest of this garbage, but you need to give me that box right now." Vanessa took a slow, arrogant sip of her mimosa and smiled. She leaned against the pristine white columns of the porch, looking down at me like I was a stray dog. "Bastards do not get keepsakes, Blair," she sneered, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You heard what Mr. Mitchell read today. You are a genetic mistake." Mom decided it was time to cleanse the house of all the toxic energy. Everything you ever touched in this house is either in that dumpster or already on its way to the city landfill. The jewelry box went in the first trash bag. I stared at her, feeling a cold, dark rage settling deep in my chest. I walked past her toward the heavy oak front door and grabbed the solid brass handle. It did not budge. I pulled out my silver house key and shoved it into the lock. It jammed halfway. They had already changed the locks. "You cannot just lock me out," I said, turning back to face her. "This is still my legal residence." The heavy front door swung open and Diane stepped out onto the porch. She was holding a cordless landline phone to her ear. Her face was set in a tight, cruel expression. She did not look like a grieving widow anymore. She looked like a general commanding a battlefield. She glared at me with absolute disgust. "Yes, operator. I need officers dispatched to my residence immediately," Diane said, speaking loudly into the phone so I could hear every single word. "There is a hostile intruder on my property. My estranged stepdaughter is trespassing, and she is acting completely unhinged. She is refusing to leave the premises. I am an elderly widow who fears for my physical safety." Diane lowered the phone and offered me a wicked, satisfied smile. "The police are on their way, Blair. You have exactly 5 minutes to get off my property before I have you arrested and thrown in a holding cell." Vanessa laughed loudly, clinking her mimosa glass against the wooden porch railing. "You should probably run along now," little orphan Vanessa mocked. "Or maybe you can dig through the trash a little longer before the cops put you in handcuffs." They stood there side by side, two women who had spent my entire life trying to erase my existence. They thought they had finally won. They thought stripping away my history and locking me out in the rain would break me completely. They thought calling the police would intimidate me into walking away forever, but they had absolutely no idea what I had securely saved on my phone. Within 10 minutes, the wail of police sirens cut through the heavy Seattle rain. 2 black and white patrol cars pulled into the circular driveway, stopping just inches from the massive green dumpster. 3 officers stepped out into the downpour, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Before they could even approach me, Diane was already putting on an Oscar-worthy performance. She practically threw herself down the porch steps, clutching her chest and sobbing hysterically. "Oh, thank God you are here, officers," she cried out, her voice trembling perfectly. "That woman is my estranged stepdaughter. She showed up here completely unhinged, demanding money and trying to break into my home. My husband just passed away, and I am terrified for my life." Vanessa immediately flanked her mother, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and glaring at me. "She is dangerous," Officer Vanessa added, playing the protective daughter. "We had to change the locks today because she kept threatening us. Please, you have to remove her from our property." The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, nodded sympathetically at Diane before turning his attention to me. He marched over to where I was standing near the dumpster, his posture rigid and commanding. "Mom, I need you to step away from the trash bin and hand over your identification," he said firmly. "You are trespassing on private property and the homeowner wants you gone. If you do not comply right now, you will be leaving in the back of my cruiser." I did not raise my hands in defense, and I certainly did not cry. I calmly reached into my trench coat pocket, pulled out my driver's license, and handed it to the officer. Then I unlocked my phone and opened a secure encrypted folder. "Officer, I completely understand why you are responding this way. Based on what she told you," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. "But I am not trespassing. This is my legal residence, and the woman crying on the porch is currently committing a crime against my property." The officer frowned, looking back and forth between my calm demeanor and Diane's theatrical sobbing. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone slightly less aggressive. "She is the homeowner." "I am the homeowner," I corrected him, holding my phone out so he could see the screen. "I am a forensic accountant officer. I deal with property records and legal documents for a living. What you are looking at is a certified digital copy of the property deed filed with the county clerk's office 10 years ago. My late father transferred exactly 50% of this estate into my name. Diane only owns the other half. I have every legal right to be standing in this driveway." The officer took my phone and squinted at the screen, reading the legal jargon. As his eyes scanned the document, his stern expression shifted into one of realization. He handed the phone back to me and let out a heavy sigh. He turned around and walked back toward the porch where Diane and Vanessa were waiting expectantly for me to be arrested. "Mom," the officer said, addressing Diane, his voice now completely devoid of sympathy. "Are you aware that the woman standing over there is a 50% co-owner of this property?" Diane's fake tears stopped instantly. She froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "That is impossible," she snapped, dropping the fragile widow act completely. "My husband left everything to me." "She is lying." "She is not lying, Mom," the officer replied, gesturing toward the dumpster. "I just verified the county deed. She has equal rights to this house. And since she is a co-owner, that means you just illegally disposed of her personal property. In the state of Washington, destroying or throwing away a co-owner's belongings without their consent is a serious offense. If she wants to press charges against you for property damage right now, I will have to place you under arrest." The color drained entirely from Diane's face. She took a physical step back, bumping into the front door. Vanessa, who had been smirking just moments ago, suddenly looked terrified. She let go of her mother and retreated into the house, not wanting any part of a criminal charge. The lead officer looked at me, waiting for my decision. I looked at the dumpster and then at Diane. "I am not pressing charges today, officer," I said loudly. "I only came for a wooden jewelry box belonging to my biological mother. Once I find it, I will leave peacefully." The officer nodded and turned toward Diane. "You heard her," he commanded sternly. "Start digging and help her find that box right now." I watched the rain plaster Diane's silk blouse to her skin as she begrudgingly dug through the wet garbage. 10 minutes later, her trembling fingers finally pulled out the small wooden jewelry box. She shoved it into my hands. I wiped the grime off the wood, walked to my car, and drove away, leaving them in their mess. It was a small victory, but I knew women like my stepmother did not lose gracefully. They always retaliated. The next morning, I walked into the sleek downtown Seattle offices of my forensic accounting firm. I had spent 7 years building a flawless reputation, tracing illicit funds, and exposing corporate fraud. I needed the distraction of work. But before I could even sit down, my phone rang. It was the managing partner asking me to report to Human Resources immediately. I walked into the glass-walled conference room and instantly knew something was terribly wrong. The managing partner was sitting next to the director of Human Resources. Neither offered a greeting. The HR director pushed a thick manila folder across the table toward me. "Blair, we received an emergency notification from the State Accountancy Board this morning," she said, her voice clipped. "They opened a formal investigation into your conduct, and we must take immediate action." I opened the folder. Sitting on top was a formal complaint filed with the state board. It was technically anonymous, but the language was unmistakably Diane. The complaint accused me of elderly financial fraud. It claimed I used my specialized accounting skills to manipulate my late father, taking advantage of his declining health to secretly siphon assets. It included sworn affidavits from 3 anonymous witnesses who claimed they heard my father express terror over my control of his finances. I recognized the addresses listed on the affidavits. They were all located in Diane's exclusive gated community. She had mobilized her wealthy country club friends to perjure themselves just to destroy my career. "This is fabricated," I said, keeping my voice even though my heart was hammering. "My stepmother is trying to weaponize the board to force me out of a probate dispute. I can provide the deed to the property and bank statements proving my father was of sound mind." The managing partner sighed, rubbing his temples. "We know your track record, Blair, but you also know the protocol. When the state board opens an investigation into financial abuse, especially involving a vulnerable family member, we cannot keep you on active client accounts. You handle sensitive financial data for Fortune 500 companies. Our firm cannot risk the liability. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay until the board concludes its investigation. Suspended without pay." The words echoed in the quiet conference room. I stared at the formal letter of suspension waiting for me to sign. Diane knew exactly what she was doing. She knew I needed my salary to hire a heavy-hitting probate litigator. She was trying to starve me out financially and legally. If I had no income, I could not fight her in court. She wanted me desperate broke and begging for a meager settlement. "We need your company laptop, your access badge, and your corporate credit card," the HR director added, holding out a plastic bin. "You cannot access firm servers or contact clients until this is resolved." "I am sorry, Blair." I looked at the 2 executives. Yelling or defending myself further would do absolutely nothing. The machine had already been set in motion. I unclipped my security badge from my blazer. I pulled my corporate phone and laptop from my tote bag and placed them into the bin. I signed the paperwork with a steady hand. "I understand the firm's position," I said calmly. "I will cooperate fully with the board and clear my name." I stood up slowly, pushed my chair back, and walked out of the glass room holding my head high. I completely ignored the quiet whispers of my coworkers as I gathered my personal belongings and took the express elevator down to the main lobby. Stepping out onto this busy Seattle street and looking up at the gray sky, I felt a sudden, overwhelming chill. In 24 hours, Diane had tried to strip away my inheritance, lock me out of my family home, and completely dismantle my professional livelihood. She thought taking away my job would leave me helpless. But she made one catastrophic miscalculation. By suspending me, she had just given a highly trained forensic accountant 40 hours a week of completely uninterrupted free time. If she wanted to play a game of hidden finances, she had just picked a fight with the absolute worst person on earth. I walked toward the downtown subway station, my mind already shifting from defense to offense. By the time I unlocked the door to my apartment, the Seattle rain had finally stopped, but the storm inside my head was just beginning. I tossed my wet trench coat onto a chair and immediately went to work. I pushed my coffee table against the wall and dragged my 2 large whiteboards out of the home office. I did not need my corporate laptop to do my job. As a forensic accountant, I had my own custom-built desktop server loaded with data extraction software that could bypass almost any standard security wall. I booted up the system, the dual monitors casting a harsh blue glow across my living room. I brewed a massive pot of black coffee and tied my hair back. Diane wanted to accuse me of financial abuse to freeze my assets. She assumed I would spend all my time frantically trying to access my own frozen bank accounts or begging a lawyer to take my case pro bono. But she did not understand how a financial investigator actually thinks. I was not going to look for my money. I was going to look for hers. My father was a brilliant businessman, but his digital security habits were stuck in the late 90s. Years ago, he had given me an administrative backdoor password to his primary holding company server to help him audit a rogue vendor. He never changed the password. I typed the old credentials into my terminal and held my breath. The screen blinked green. Access granted. I was deep inside the archived financial matrix of his entire commercial empire. I ignored the main probate estate accounts. Diane and her lawyers would have already sanitized those ledgers. Instead, I went straight for the operational expenditure files. I ran a targeted algorithm designed to flag anomalies in discretionary spending over the last 10 years. I was looking for shadow transactions, unapproved vendor payments, or anything that carried Diane's digital signature. For 3 hours, the screen displayed nothing but mundane corporate expenses. Payroll taxes, property maintenance fees, equipment, depreciation. I rubbed my tired eyes, feeling a brief wave of defeat. Maybe she really was just a greedy widow fighting over a legitimate will. But then my algorithm pinged. A single red line of text appeared on the second monitor, then another, and another. Soon, an entire spreadsheet populated with hundreds of flagged transactions. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding against my ribs as I analyzed the data. It was a masterclass in financial structuring. In the banking world, we call it smurfing. Every single month for the past 12 years, someone had been wiring money out of my father's secondary business accounts. The amounts were bizarrely specific: $9,900, $9,850, $9,999, always carefully hovering just below the $10,000 threshold. Anyone who knows federal banking laws knows exactly why you do that. Any transaction over $10,000 automatically triggers a currency transaction report with the IRS. By keeping the wire transfers just a few dollars under the limit, the sender effectively bypasses federal monitoring systems, keeping the money completely invisible. I started tracing the destination routing numbers. The funds were not going into any of Diane's personal checking accounts. They were not going to a local bank in Washington. The money was being funneled through a complex web of shell companies before finally landing in a numbered offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I opened a new window and ran a quick calculation. 12 years of monthly transfers, sometimes twice a month. The total amount of money siphoned out of my father's estate was staggering. It was not just a few $1,000s to cover a shopping spree. We were looking at millions. Diane was not just a bitter stepmother trying to steal my inheritance. She was an active embezzler who had been bleeding my father dry right under his nose. But why? She already had access to his wealth. She lived in a mansion, drove luxury cars, and threw lavish parties. There was no logical reason for her to systematically steal and hide millions of dollars in a secret offshore account, unless she was paying someone off. I stared at the blinking cursor on the screen, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. She had a massive financial leak, and she needed my father dead, or at least fully under her medical control, before anyone noticed the missing capital. I printed out the entire ledger, the printer whirring to life in the quiet apartment. I had the financial footprint, but I needed a physical connection to prove she authorized the transfers. I needed a mistake. And right on cue, my personal cell phone buzzed. The screen of my phone lit up with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief and cryptic. "Meet me at the Roasting Bean on 4th Avenue in 20 minutes. Come alone." I stared at the glowing screen for a moment, my forensic instincts immediately putting me on high alert. I did not recognize the number, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. I grabbed my trench coat, locked down my computer terminal, and headed back out into the damp Seattle afternoon. The coffee shop was a small, dimly lit place tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, far from the gleaming high-rises where my corporate office was located. It was the kind of place where people went to be ignored. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the bell jingling softly above me. I scanned the room. Sitting in the darkest corner booth nursing a black coffee was Donovan. He looked completely different from the sharp, composed real estate attorney I had seen just 24 hours earlier at Mr. Mitchell's office. His tie was gone, his collar was unbuttoned, and the heavy bags under his eyes suggested he had not slept a single minute since the DNA bombshell. I slid into the booth across from him, keeping my guard up. "You used a burner phone," I said quietly, taking in his exhausted posture. "You are a lawyer, Donovan. You know better than to get involved in an active dispute between estate beneficiaries." He let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. "I am not getting involved in an estate dispute, Blair," he said, his voice rough. "I am doing damage control on my entire life. After what happened at the lawyer's office yesterday, I went home and locked myself in my study. I started pulling every single financial record tied to my marriage. I audited my own wife." He paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He looked like a man who had just watched his house burn to the ground. "You know I grew up with nothing, Blair. I worked 3 jobs to get through law school. When Vanessa and I had our 2 children, the very first thing I did was set up bulletproof college funds for them. I wanted to make sure they never had to struggle the way I did. I put every bonus, every extra commission straight into those accounts." Donovan leaned forward across the small wooden table, his eyes burning with a mixture of rage and profound betrayal. "Last night I logged into those accounts. They are completely empty. Every single dollar is gone. Vanessa drained our children's future to pay off hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden credit card debts. She spent their college tuition on designer handbags, luxury spa weekends, and first-class flights to Europe with her country club friends. She stole from her own children to keep up the illusion of wealth." I sat back in the booth stunned. Even knowing how vain and superficial Vanessa was, I never thought she would stoop to stealing from her own kids. "I am so sorry, Donovan," I said softly. "I really am." He waved off my sympathy, his expression hardening into pure, cold resolve. "I do not need pity," he said firmly. "I need leverage. I spent the morning drafting divorce papers and emergency custody orders, but Vanessa and Diane are venomous. They will try to destroy my reputation and take my kids out of pure spite. I need to burn their entire operation to the ground before they can strike first." Donovan reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, tarnished brass key attached to a faded yellow plastic tag. He placed it on the table and slid it slowly across the wood until it rested right in front of me. "What is this?" I asked, staring at the piece of metal. "It is the key to a climate-controlled storage unit in an industrial park just outside the city limits," Donovan explained. "A few years ago, Vanessa got drunk at a holiday party and slipped up. She complained about having to drive out to the middle of nowhere to pay the cash rental fee for her mother's secret storage locker. Diane never leaves a paper trail for the things she truly wants hidden. She pays the manager in cash every 6 months. I drove out there this morning and bribed the manager to confirm the unit number, but as a lawyer, I cannot be caught illegally accessing it. You, on the other hand, have nothing to lose right now." I reached out and closed my hand around the cold brass key. My pulse quickened. This was it, the physical location where Diane kept the skeletons. Donovan stood up, buttoning his jacket. He looked down at me, his expression deadly serious. "I am doing this to protect my kids from your toxic family. Whatever you find in that unit, use it to bury them." He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving me alone in the booth. I looked at the brass key in my palm. Diane thought she had outsmarted everyone by keeping her dirty secrets off the digital grid. But she had underestimated the collateral damage of her own lies. I left a $5 bill on the table for the coffee I did not order and walked out to my car. I had a storage unit to open. Storage unit? I drove out to the industrial park on the edge of the city limits just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The place was a sprawling maze of corrugated metal buildings, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It looked exactly like the kind of place someone would use to hide their darkest secrets. I parked my car in front of a row of rusted orange doors and checked the numbers against the text message Donovan had sent me. Unit 409. I grabbed my flashlight, a pair of latex gloves, and the small brass key. The lock was stiff, but it finally clicked open with a heavy metallic clunk. I rolled the heavy door up and stepped inside the dusty, climate-controlled unit. The smell of old paper and mothballs hit me instantly. I flicked on my flashlight, cutting through the gloom. The unit was packed tightly with cardboard boxes, old furniture covered in plastic tarps, and towering stacks of files. To anyone else, it would look like the harmless hoard of an elderly widow who could not bear to throw away her past. But I knew Diane. She did not keep things for sentimental reasons. She kept things because they gave her leverage. I bypassed the obvious boxes labeled with innocent tags like holiday decorations and old kitchenware. Those were just decoys. I focused my attention on the back corner of the unit, where a heavy steel filing cabinet sat partially hidden behind a broken grandfather clock. The cabinet was old gray and covered in a thick layer of dust. I pulled open the top 3 drawers. They were filled with mundane household receipts and expired warranties from the early 2000s. Exactly what you would expect to find in a forgotten storage unit. But when I pulled the bottom drawer open, I noticed something strange. The drawer was unusually shallow compared to the others. I ran my gloved hands along the interior metal sides, pressing firmly against the bottom panel. There was a slight give. I wedged a small flathead screwdriver from my car into the seam and pried upward. The false bottom popped off with a sharp snap, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. Inside the compartment were 3 pristine black leather binders. I pulled them out and set them on top of a nearby plastic tote. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the first binder. It was filled with yellowing documents, neatly organized by year dating, all the way back to the early 1980s. These were not my father's business records. These were Diane's personal tax returns from the years before she met my father. I turned on my phone flashlight and held it closer to the brittle paper. The numbers were jarring. According to these returns, Diane had been claiming an income of barely $30,000 a year, working as a part-time receptionist. But the deduction columns told a completely different story. Every single year she had declared massive alimony payments and child support distributions that far exceeded her stated income. The math made absolutely no sense. How could a woman earning $30,000 a year afford to pay out nearly $50,000 in support payments without declaring bankruptcy? I flipped to the attached bank statements from 1986. The year Vanessa was born. The statements showed consistent incoming wire transfers from an unknown corporate entity, which Diane immediately routed out to a single recurring payee. I ran my finger down the ledger until I found the name: Richard Hughes. The payments to Richard Hughes continued aggressively, year after year. They were not child support or alimony. They were structured exactly like the offshore wire transfers I had just discovered on my father's servers. The only difference was the source of the funds. Before she married my father, Diane was being funded by someone else to pay off Richard Hughes. But once she secured my father's wealth, she shifted the financial burden onto his empire. Richard Hughes was the black hole draining Diane's finances, and given the timeline, there was only one logical explanation for who this man was. He was Vanessa's actual biological father, but why was Diane paying him? Usually the mother receives child support, not the other way around. Unless Richard Hughes had something on her. Unless he was blackmailing her. I pulled out my phone and snapped high-resolution photos of every single page in the 3 binders. I documented the tax returns, the bank statements, and the continuous payments to Richard Hughes. I had found the motive for the $5 million embezzlement. Diane was not just stealing out of greed. She was stealing to keep a massive extortion scheme buried. I closed the binders, placed them back in the hidden compartment, and snapped the false bottom back into place. I rolled the heavy metal door shut, locking the unit tight. The puzzle was almost complete, but I needed to know exactly who Richard Hughes was and how he connected to the offshore shell companies. I drove back to my apartment with my mind buzzing. The Seattle traffic was non-existent at this hour of the night, allowing me to speed through the dark streets. I had the physical evidence of the extortion, but I still needed the digital bridge. I needed to prove without a shadow of a doubt that the money siphoned from my father's accounts went directly into the pockets of Richard Hughes. I walked into my living room, threw my keys on the counter, and immediately sat back down at my dual-monitor workstation. My coffee was completely cold, but I drank it anyway, needing the caffeine hit. I opened a secure encrypted browser and logged into the Federal Corporate Registry databases. Searching for a name like Richard Hughes was like looking for a needle in a massive digital haystack. There were thousands of men with that name across the country. I needed to narrow the search parameters. I pulled out my phone and looked at the photos of Diane's old tax returns. The original child support payments from 1986 were routed to a regional bank located in Las Vegas, Nevada. I typed the state and the specific banking routing numbers into my search algorithm and hit enter. The screen blinked, and the thousands of results instantly dropped to a single matching profile: Richard Allen Hughes. I clicked on his associated business filings and my jaw clenched. The man was not just a ghost from Diane's past, he was a career grifter. Over the last 3 decades, Richard Hughes had registered dozens of limited liability companies across Nevada and Delaware. There was a property management firm that owned 0 properties. There was a logistics consulting agency with no registered employees. There was a venture capital fund that had never filed a single public investment disclosure. They were all textbook shell companies, entities created on paper solely to receive and wash illicit money. I opened my spreadsheet containing the flagged wire transfers from my father's operational accounts. I started cross-referencing the offshore routing numbers with the registered corporate accounts of Richard's shell companies. The match was perfect. Every single time Diane wired money out of the family estate, it bounced through an intermediary bank in the Cayman Islands before landing directly in one of Richard's fraudulent business accounts. She was not just paying him hush money to keep Vanessa's paternity a secret, she was actively funding his entire fraudulent lifestyle. Every time one of his fake businesses went under, Diane would steal more of my father's money to bail him out and help him set up the next scam. I started running a cumulative total on my second monitor, adding up every single wire transfer over the 12-year period. The numbers climbed higher and higher, spinning like a slot machine until they finally stopped. $5,240,000. I sat back in my chair staring at the final number in absolute disbelief. Diane had embezzled over $5 million from her own husband. She had stolen from the man who gave her a mansion designer clothes and a life of absolute luxury just to fund the pathetic schemes of her former lover. My father had worked 60-hour weeks building his business from the ground up, and Diane had bled him dry to protect her own selfish lies. The sheer scale of the crime moved this far beyond a simple family dispute over a will. This was federal wire fraud. This was money laundering. This was a massive criminal conspiracy. Diane thought she was untouchable because she had a crumpled medical power of attorney and a country club membership. She thought she could starve me out by calling my firm and getting me suspended. But she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her completely. I leaned forward and began downloading every single corporate filing, every bank routing match, and every shell company registration into a master encrypted file. I printed out the final spreadsheet showing the $5 million total and placed it right next to the photos of Diane's tax returns. The paper trail was absolutely flawless. Any forensic auditor in the country would look at this and immediately call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had everything I needed. But I was not going to just hand it over to the police. I wanted Diane to feel exactly what she tried to make me feel. I wanted her to stand in front of her wealthy friends and watch her entire life shatter. I checked the glowing digital clock on my desk. It was nearly 3 in the morning. I closed my laptop, shut off the monitors, and smiled alone in the quiet, dark room. The trap was set. The morning sun crept through the blinds, casting long shadows across my living room. I had not slept a single minute, but I had never felt more awake. My dining table was completely covered in stacks of paper, high-resolution photographs, and encrypted flash drives. I spent the next 4 hours organizing the chaos into a single, devastating weapon. I purchased 3 heavy-duty black binders and carefully arranged the documents. Tab A contained the DNA results and the Nevada tax returns, proving Vanessa was Richard Hughes' biological daughter. Tab B held the 12-year ledger of offshore wire transfers, totaling $5,240,000. Tab C contained the federal corporate registry files linking the offshore accounts directly to Richard's shell companies. I placed a secure USB drive into the front pocket of each binder containing every digital footprint I had extracted from my father's server. This was not just a legal defense anymore. It was a fully loaded federal indictment wrapped in black leather. I packed one binder into my briefcase and locked the other 2 inside my fireproof safe. It was time to make my first move. I did not go to Lawyer Mitchell's office. I knew Diane would be having him watched, or at least constantly calling his receptionist to check his visitor log. Instead, I sent him a secure email demanding a private meeting at a neutral location. We met at a quiet private library downtown, a place where the thick mahogany walls absorbed sound and ensured absolute privacy. Mr. Mitchell arrived looking weary, his briefcase heavy in his hands. He sat across from me in a leather armchair, sighing deeply. "Blair, I should not be meeting with you without your stepmother's legal counsel present," he warned, his voice low. "Diane is already threatening to sue my firm for allowing the DNA test to be read in the first place." I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened my briefcase, pulled out the black binder, and slid it across the polished wooden table. "You are going to want to see this, Mr. Mitchell," I said calmly. "Because if you proceed with the probate hearing under the current jurisdiction, you will be making yourself an accessory to federal money laundering." He opened the binder to the second tab, and his eyes immediately locked onto the 12-year wire transfer ledger. I watched as his professional composure completely evaporated. The color drained from his face as his eyes darted from the offshore routing numbers to the matching shell company accounts. "My God," he whispered, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "She has been draining the corporate accounts for over a decade." I only showed him the financial fraud, keeping the tax returns and Vanessa's true paternity hidden for now. I needed him focused purely on the money. "If we go to standard probate court, Diane will use her forged medical proxy to tie this up for years," I explained, leaning forward. "But this amount of money crossing international borders triggers federal jurisdiction. File an emergency motion this afternoon. Move the probate hearing to a strict federal judge." Mitchell looked at me, his expression a mix of shock and profound respect. He closed the binder and nodded slowly. "Consider it done, Blair. Diane will not see this coming." I left the quiet downtown library, feeling a deep surge of cold, undeniable satisfaction. As I walked back to my parked car, my cell phone suddenly buzzed violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and saw a new text message from Diane. She was clearly feeling extremely bold, probably assuming that my recent suspension from the corporate accounting firm had completely broken my fighting spirit. The mocking message read, "I just heard all about your little job problem. It is such a terrible shame. Since I am a very generous woman, I am willing to offer you a one-time financial settlement of exactly $10,000. Take the money today and walk away quietly before you end up completely homeless and destitute. You have until tomorrow morning to make your final decision." She actually thought she could easily buy my total silence with absolute pocket change while she was secretly sitting on over $5 million of stolen money. She genuinely thought she had me perfectly cornered. I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat. I did not type an angry paragraph or threaten her with the massive federal evidence I had just compiled. I simply typed a 6-word response and hit send. "See you at the country club." I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat and started the engine. Diane was hosting her lavish memorial dinner tonight, and I was about to crash the party. I pulled up to the valet stand of the Oak Ridge Country Club just as the sun dipped completely below the horizon. The sprawling estate was illuminated by massive floodlights, and the circular driveway was packed with luxury imported cars. My father was a humble man who absolutely hated pretentious displays of wealth. In his will, he explicitly asked for a quiet scattering of his ashes over the Puget Sound with only immediate family present. Instead, Diane had transformed his death into the social event of the season. She had rented out the entire grand ballroom complete with massive ice sculptures, a live string quartet, and an open bar serving top-shelf champagne. It was not a memorial. It was a highly calculated victory lap. I slipped past the front desk, easily blending into the massive crowd of 200 elite guests. I was dressed in a sharp black tailored suit, holding a simple leather clutch that contained my phone and a single folded federal subpoena. I stood near the back of the room, partially hidden by a towering floral arrangement of white orchids, and watched the spectacle unfold. Diane was holding court near the center of the room, draped in a custom black silk gown that probably cost more than my first car. She was laughing softly, sipping expensive champagne, and accepting endless condolences from the city's wealthiest socialites. Vanessa was right by her side, wearing a sleek black designer cocktail dress and an enormous diamond necklace. I scanned the room for Donovan, but he was nowhere to be seen. He had kept his word. He was probably already halfway across the city, with his children finalizing the emergency custody orders, while his wife paraded around completely oblivious to her impending doom. The hypocrisy in the room was suffocating. These people were raising their expensive crystal glasses to a man they barely knew, completely unaware that the grieving widow and the dutiful daughter standing before them had spent the last 12 years systematically robbing him blind. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, and a waiter tapped a silver spoon against a glass. The room fell silent as Diane elegantly climbed the steps to the small stage at the front of the ballroom. She adjusted the microphone, taking a deep theatrical breath. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed sorrow. "My late husband was a pillar of this community. He was a generous, loving man who gave everything to his family and to the city he loved so deeply. It has been a dark, devastating week for us. But looking out at all of your supportive faces, I know he is smiling down on us right now." A collective murmur of sympathy rolled through the wealthy crowd. Diane wiped a dry eye with a lace handkerchief before her expression shifted from sorrow to resolute determination. "As many of you know, my husband's proudest achievement was the Family Charitable Foundation. He poured his heart into funding local schools, hospitals, and community centers. In his final days, he expressed a deep desire to see that legacy continue unbroken. We cannot let his incredible philanthropic work die with him. That is why tonight I am stepping down as the secondary overseer of the foundation to make way for the next generation." She extended a manicured hand toward her daughter. "I am incredibly proud to announce that my daughter Vanessa will be taking over as the sole director of the Family Charitable Foundation effective immediately." The room erupted into loud, polite applause. Vanessa beamed, stepping onto the stage to hug her mother. From the back of the room, my blood ran cold as the final piece of their strategy clicked perfectly into place. The charitable foundation was the only entity completely separate from the locked probate estate. It held over $8 million in liquid assets intended for public grants. By making Vanessa the sole director, Diane was giving her daughter unchecked legal authority to write checks, approve grants, and transfer funds without any board oversight. Since the offshore well had run dry with my father passing, they were pivoting to an entirely new source of cash. They were going to drain the charity. They planned to funnel the foundation millions through Richard Hughes' shell companies under the guise of anonymous charitable donations. It was a brilliant, highly illegal pivot. They were about to steal money meant for sick children to pay off a blackmailer and fund their lavish lifestyle. The applause began to die down. and Diane leaned back into the microphone, her eyes scanning the crowd with a triumphant glint. But before we move forward, Diane said, her voice dropping into a somber, pitying tone. There is an unfortunate piece of family business I must address publicly to protect my husband's good name. As many of you know, my late husband had an older daughter from his first marriage. Diane said, her voice dropping to a fragile whisper that echoed perfectly through the high-end audio system. We always tried our absolute best to integrate Blair into our loving home. We provided her with the finest education, endless opportunities, and our unconditional support. But some people simply carry a deep darkness inside them that no amount of love or patience can ever truly fix. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the ice clinking in the crystal glasses. I stood completely still behind the floral arrangement, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I watched Diane manipulate 200 of the smartest, most influential people in Seattle with nothing but a few fake tears and a well-timed pause. It breaks my heart to stand here and say this, but I must protect the integrity of my husband. Legacy. Diane continued, pressing her lace handkerchief to her chest. Over the past few months of his declining health, we discovered something horrifying. Blair used her specialized skills as a financial accountant to manipulate her dying father. She took advantage of his confused state and systematically stole from his private accounts. She committed unimaginable elderly financial abuse against the very man who gave her everything. A collective gasp rippled across the grand ballroom. Several older women in the front row brought their hands to their mouths in shock. Wealthy investors and local politicians exchanged disgusted whispers. Diane had targeted the one fear every wealthy older person in that room shared: the fear of being financially exploited by their own children in their most vulnerable final years. The situation has become so severe that the state accountancy board has formally suspended her corporate license, Diane announced, shaking her head in manufactured disbelief. And there is currently an active federal investigation into her fraudulent activities. She tried to bankrupt this family. She tried to steal the money intended for the very charitable foundation we are gathered here to protect tonight. But I promise all of you I will not let that happen. Vanessa and I will stand as a fortress against her greed. We will ensure every single dollar of this foundation goes to the children and hospitals who actually need it. The crowd broke into a spontaneous round of applause. It was not polite applause this time. It was the fierce, protective applause of a community rallying around a victimized widow. They were completely sold on the narrative. I shifted my gaze from the stage to the VIP table sitting directly in front of the podium. Vanessa was lounging in her velvet chair, radiating pure, arrogant triumph. She was holding a fresh glass of vintage champagne, swirling it slowly as she looked out over the crowd. A smug, satisfied smirk was plastered across her perfect face. She caught the eye of a wealthy tech CEO sitting at the next table and offered him a brave, tragic smile, playing the role of the traumatized sister to absolute perfection. She was already mentally spending the foundation millions. She thought the war was over. She thought dragging my name through the mud in front of the entire Seattle elite would shame me into hiding forever. The air in the ballroom felt thick and heavy, suffocating under the weight of their massive collective lie. Diane stood at the podium, soaking in the applause, her eyes gleaming with absolute victory. She raised her hand gracefully, asking the crowd to quiet down so she could finish her toast. She took a deep breath, ready to deliver the final nail in my coffin. To my incredible husband, she declared, raising her glass high into the air, "We will protect your legacy. We will protect this foundation. And we will never let the darkness of one ungrateful child ruin the brilliant light of your life." The 200 guests raised their glasses in unison. To Theodore, they chanted, their voices booming through the elegant room. I stepped out from behind the white orchids. I did not rush. I did not shout. I simply smoothed the front of my black blazer and began walking directly down the center aisle of the ballroom. The thick red carpet silenced my footsteps, but I did not need to make a sound. At the exact moment the guests began to lower their crystal glasses, The massive brass-handled double doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly swung open with a heavy, echoing thud. A cold gust of evening wind swept into the warm room, causing the candle flames on the tables to flicker wildly. The sudden noise broke the reverie. Heads began to turn one by one. The whispers died instantly. The tension in the room reached an absolute boiling point as 200 pairs of eyes slowly shifted from the grieving widow on the stage to the woman walking straight toward her. I kept my head high and my shoulders pulled back as I walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The wealthy guests instinctively parted, making a clear, wide path for me. They stared in absolute silence, probably expecting me to scream or cry or cause the exact kind of hysterical scene Diane had just described. I did not give them that satisfaction. My black suit was impeccably pressed. I did not look like a troubled stepdaughter begging for scraps or a desperate woman facing a scandal. I looked exactly like what I was, a forensic accountant who had just found the missing ledger. The string quartet remained completely frozen with their bows hovering over their violins. The only sound in the massive room was the steady, confident click of my heels against the polished hardwood floor beneath the plush red carpet. I looked briefly to my left and right, catching the eyes of influential board members. Their expressions had shifted from righteous disgust to intense confusion. They were smart business people. They knew that a guilty person does not confidently crash a room full of their enemies. I was not hiding. On the brightly lit stage, Diane's triumphant smile completely vanished. Her grip on the microphone stand tightened so aggressively that her knuckles turned white. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. At the VIP table, Vanessa dropped her crystal glass. It hit the table, spilling champagne over the white tablecloth. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She knew I should be sitting alone in my dark apartment, completely broken by my sudden corporate suspension. Seeing me here confident and unbothered sent a massive shockwave of sheer terror straight through her. I reached the front of the room and gracefully climbed the 3 carpeted steps onto the stage. Diane physically took a step backward as I approached her heels, scraping loudly against the wooden floorboards. "You are not supposed to be here," she hissed. Her voice was a desperate, shaking whisper that was accidentally picked up by the sensitive microphone and broadcast to the entire confused room. "Security was strictly instructed to keep you out of this building." I did not reply to her frantic threat. I stopped right in front of the tall wooden podium. I opened my simple black leather clutch and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope. The official federal seal stamped boldly on the front of the thick envelope was dark blue and impossible for anyone to miss. I held it out directly toward her chest. Diane stared at the envelope like it was a live explosive device. She rigidly kept her arms at her sides, refusing to take it from my hands. I simply offered a polite nod and calmly placed the heavy document on the wooden podium right next to her crumpled lace handkerchief. I leaned slightly toward the microphone, my voice ringing out clear and steady across the breathless, silent ballroom. "Diane," I said formally, making absolutely sure every single person in the room could hear my exact words. "You have just been officially served with a federal subpoena. Effective immediately, every single bank account holding asset and investment portfolio tied to the Family Charitable Foundation is completely frozen by direct order of the federal court. No one in your family can withdraw a single dime." A collective loud gasp echoed from the wealthy crowd. Diane's heavily powdered face turned the sickly color of ash. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another elaborate lie, but her voice completely failed her. I continued, my tone completely devoid of anger or malice. "The federal court has authorized a full independent forensic audit of the foundation and all associated private estate accounts to thoroughly investigate a massive discrepancy involving offshore wire transfers. The emergency federal probate hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. Bring your absolute best lawyer, Diane. You are definitely going to need him." I stepped back from the microphone and smoothed my jacket. I did not call her a thief. I did not hurl insults at Vanessa. I did not try to defend my own personal character to the 200 guests who had just judged me so harshly. The heavy manila envelope sitting on the podium did all the talking for me. I turned around and walked calmly back down the stairs. The tense silence in the ballroom instantly shattered. The crowd erupted into a chaotic frenzy of shocked whispers and angry questions. Wealthy donors began demanding answers about the safety of their money. I did not look back at the stage. I simply pushed open the heavy brass doors and walked out into the cool, crisp Seattle night air, leaving their fake empire burning entirely to the ground. The drive back to my apartment was quiet, but my mind was completely focused on the chaos I had just left behind at the country club. I knew exactly what Diane and Vanessa would do next. Criminals always follow a predictable pattern when they are cornered. They do not confess, and they do not hire lawyers immediately. They try to destroy the evidence. While I was safely locking the black binders inside my fireproof safe, Diane and Vanessa were speeding back to the sprawling colonial estate in a state of absolute panic. The grand memorial dinner had abruptly ended in whispers and frantic phone calls from wealthy investors. Diane had practically sprinted to her luxury car, leaving her confused guests to foot the massive bar tab. Inside the heavily decorated home office of the estate, the heavy oak doors were locked tight. The usually pristine room looked like a hurricane had just torn through it. Desk drawers were pulled completely out and dumped onto the expensive Persian rug. File cabinets were thrown open. In the corner, a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder was running at maximum capacity. The loud grinding noise of the metal teeth chewing through thick stacks of paper filled the entire room. Vanessa was sitting on the floor, hyperventilating her designer cocktail dress, ruined by sweat and dust. She was frantically feeding years of charitable foundation bank statements into the machine. "We cannot let the federal auditors see these ledger books," Vanessa cried, her voice cracking with pure terror. "If they match the foundation routing numbers to those offshore accounts, we are both going to federal prison, Mom." Diane was pacing aggressively behind the large mahogany desk, her hands shaking as she ripped pages out of a black leather binder. "Shut up and keep shredding!" Diane snapped, her face pale and twisted with rage. "Blair is bluffing. She does not have the complete paper trail. She only has the subpoena. If we destroy the internal transfer logs before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the federal judge will have absolutely nothing to audit." They were so consumed by their frantic destruction that neither of them heard the heavy front door open downstairs. They did not hear the quiet footsteps climbing the grand wooden staircase. Donovan had driven back to the house to gather the rest of his belongings after securing an emergency hotel room for the night. He walked down the carpeted hallway and stopped dead in his tracks when he heard the loud mechanical grinding of the paper shredder coming from the home office. Donovan approached the heavy oak door. It was locked, but the thick wood could not muffle the desperate screaming match happening inside. He stood completely still, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He unlocked the screen, opened the camera application, and pressed record. He held the phone close to the door, capturing the audio with perfect clarity. "What about the Cayman Island transfers?" Vanessa sobbed loudly, her voice easily piercing through the wooden door. "You sent over $5 million to Richard. The feds will easily trace those wires back to the foundation, and my signature is on the new director paperwork." Diane slammed her fists onto the wooden desk. "Listen to me carefully," Diane yelled over the noise of the shredder. "Richard is a ghost. The shell companies are dissolved. As long as these physical bank records turn into confetti tonight, nobody can ever prove I embezzled that money. Just keep feeding the paper into the machine and stop crying." Standing in the dark hallway, Donovan lowered his phone and stopped recording. He had just captured a crystal-clear audio confession of federal wire fraud and massive corporate embezzlement. He looked at the locked door, feeling a wave of absolute disgust wash over him. The woman he had married was not just a spoiled rich girl. She was a willing participant in a massive criminal conspiracy stealing money meant for sick children to protect a decades-old blackmail scheme. He did not kick the door down or confront them. They were already dead women walking. Donovan then quietly turned around and walked down the hallway to the children's bedrooms. He gently woke his sleeping son and daughter, whispering that they were going on a late-night adventure. He packed a single duffel bag with their favorite toys and warm clothes. He carried his sleeping daughter down the stairs, holding his son's hand tightly. He walked out the front door and loaded them into his car. He did not leave a note. He started the engine and drove away into the very cold, dark Seattle night, leaving his wife trapped in a house of shredded lies, completely and entirely on her own. I spent the rest of the night alone in my apartment, carefully finalizing my 3 black binders of evidence. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the silence. I sat at my dining table, running my finger down the printed spreadsheet of the $5 million wire fraud one last time to ensure every single number aligned perfectly with the federal bank records. I slid the documents into the clear plastic sleeves, closing the heavy metal rings with a satisfying snap. Tomorrow morning, the federal judge would see exactly who Diane really was. The air in my apartment felt heavy with anticipation. I leaned back in my chair, closing my burning eyes, and let my mind drift back to the very first time I had ever seen a financial ledger. I was 12 years old, sitting alone at the massive mahogany dining table in my childhood home. It was the evening of my birthday. Diane had promised to take me out for a special dinner, but she never showed up. She had completely forgotten, intentionally opting instead to attend a spontaneous cocktail hour with her country club friends. I remember staring at the melting icing on my small grocery store cake, feeling a familiar hollow ache in my chest. That was when my father walked through the front door. He looked exhausted, carrying his heavy leather briefcase, but when he saw me sitting alone, his expression softened. He did not apologize for Diane. He knew apologies would not fix the cruel indifference she constantly showed me. Instead, he walked over, pulled out the chair next to me, and opened his briefcase. He pulled out a thick, bound ledger book filled with endless columns of numbers. He handed me a sharp pencil and smiled. "You know, Blair," he had said, his voice steady and warm, "numbers are the only things in this world that will never lie to you. People will tell you stories. People will make excuses. But if you know how to follow the math, you will always find the absolute truth." He spent the next 3 hours teaching a 12-year-old girl how to balance a corporate asset sheet. We ate cold cake and traced expenditures. I remember noticing a discrepancy in one of the columns, a missing $200 from a petty cash account. I pointed it out to him, expecting him to be angry at whoever had made the mistake, but he just looked at the number and sighed softly. "Sometimes, Blair," he had murmured, "you have to let small fires burn to prevent the whole house from catching on fire." Sitting in my quiet apartment 22 years later, the memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I opened my eyes and stared at the massive $5 million total on the spreadsheet in front of me. My father was a brilliant businessman. He had built an empire from the ground up. He audited his own companies meticulously. There was absolutely no way a man who noticed a missing $200 would completely overlook a systematic $5 million drain over 12 years. He knew. He had known about the offshore transfers the whole time. He knew Diane was stealing from him to pay off Richard Hughes. But why did he let it happen? Why did he allow his own wife to embezzle millions without calling the police or filing for divorce? The answer was sitting right in front of me in the DNA results. He had known Vanessa was not his biological daughter. He knew Diane was a desperate, vicious woman cornered by a blackmailer. If my father had exposed the fraud, Diane would have retaliated with everything she had. She would have dragged the family through a brutal public scandal, and she would have directed all of her venom entirely at me. He let the small fires burn to protect his house. He let her steal the money to keep the peace, to keep her distracted so I could grow up safely under his roof. He bought my peace with his own fortune. And when he knew he was dying, he transferred half the estate deed directly into my name, quietly ensuring I would always have a home. He never gave her the satisfaction of a confrontation. He just quietly built a fortress around me. I closed the black binder, running my hand over the smooth leather cover. My father had protected me in the only way he knew how. He had used his wealth as a shield. But he was gone now, and the shield was down. Diane had mistaken his strategic silence for weakness. She thought she had outsmarted a dying old man. She did not realize that the 12-year-old girl he taught to read ledgers was now a forensic accountant holding the matches. The storm was coming tomorrow morning, and I was going to burn her entire fraudulent house straight to the ground. The morning air was crisp and biting as I walked up the wide granite steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle. The imposing stone columns and heavy bronze doors stood as a stark contrast to the elegant country club I had crashed the night before. This was not a place for social maneuvering or manufactured tears. This was a place for absolute hard facts. I carried my heavy briefcase in my right hand, feeling the reassuring weight of the 3 black binders inside. Lawyer Mitchell was waiting for me near the metal detectors. He looked incredibly nervous, wiping sweat from his forehead. Handling a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy was entirely out of his comfort zone. I offered him a calm, confident nod, and we walked slowly through the heavy security checkpoint together in complete, absolute silence. We entered the vast courtroom, 4B, taking our assigned seats at the petitioner's table. The room was vast, with high ceilings and dark oak paneling that commanded immediate respect. Diane and Vanessa were already sitting quietly at the respondents' table right across the aisle. They had brought an absolute army with them. 3 high-priced corporate defense attorneys in tailored charcoal suits were whispering fiercely among themselves while pulling thick legal volumes from their briefcases. Diane was dressed in a conservative black suit, clutching her signature lace handkerchief. She was playing the role of the exhausted, persecuted widow to absolute perfection. She dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes and offered her lead attorney a fragile, trembling smile. Vanessa sat rigidly beside her, looking utterly exhausted. Despite her expensive makeup, the deep dark circles under her eyes gave her away. She had clearly spent the entire night frantically running a paper shredder until her hands bled. When Diane noticed me taking my seat, she briefly dropped her grieving widow act. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom before turning quickly back to her lawyers. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff instructed the room to rise. Judge Harrison, a strict, no-nonsense federal magistrate, with a reputation for mercilessly cutting through legal games, took his seat. He slammed his wooden gavel, once the sharp crack echoing through the silent room. "We are here today on an emergency motion regarding the estate and charitable foundation assets of the deceased," Judge Harrison announced, his deep voice projecting effortlessly. "A federal subpoena was issued last night, freezing all associated accounts pending a forensic audit. The petitioners claim massive financial discrepancies. The respondents claim malicious interference. Let us get straight to the point." Before Mitchell could even stand up, Diane's lead attorney shot to his feet. He was a slick, aggressive man who charged $1,000 an hour to make wealthy people's problems disappear. "Your Honor," the defense attorney stated smoothly, stepping up to the podium, "this entire hearing is a complete waste of federal resources. The subpoena issued last night was nothing more than a desperate, malicious stunt orchestrated by a disgruntled, estranged stepdaughter. My client is a grieving widow who is currently being subjected to a baseless witch hunt. We formally request that the court immediately unfreeze the foundation accounts and dismiss this case in its entirety." The judge narrowed his eyes, peering over his reading glasses. "On what legal grounds, counselor?" The attorney reached into his leather briefcase and dramatically pulled out a pristine legal document encased in a blue folio. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "On the grounds of a binding, watertight legal contract, Your Honor. What you are looking at is the official prenuptial agreement signed by both the deceased and my client 35 years ago. It was drafted by a premier law firm and properly notarized. Section 4, paragraph B, clearly states that in the event of the husband's death, the surviving spouse is legally entitled to 100% of all physical and liquid assets, including complete executive control over any associated corporate or charitable entities. This contract explicitly supersedes any prior wills, trusts, or verbal agreements." The attorney turned around and looked directly at me, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. "Therefore, Blair has absolutely no legal standing to challenge the estate or audit the foundation. The money legally belongs entirely to Diane. She can do whatever she wants with it, and she answers to no one. The courtroom fell completely silent. Judge Harrison read through the prenuptial agreement, his expression grim. Mitchell slumped down in his chair beside me, his face pale. The document was flawless. Diane turned her head slightly, looking right at me. She did not bother hiding her triumphant smile this time. She truly believed she had just won the entire war with a single piece of paper. Judge Harrison lowered the prenuptial agreement and looked over the bench at my legal counsel. "Well, Mr. Mitchell," the judge said, his voice echoing in the large room. "The respondents have presented a legally binding contract granting absolute control of all assets to the widow. Unless you can prove this document is a forgery or present compelling evidence of catastrophic financial mismanagement, I am inclined to grant their motion for dismissal right now." Mitchell stood up slowly, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the document is not a forgery. However, the petitioner asserts that the surviving spouse has engaged in massive financial crimes against the estate prior to the execution of this will. To present this evidence, I request that my client Blair be allowed to take the stand as her own expert witness. She is a certified forensic accountant with 7 years of experience in corporate fraud investigation." Diane's lead attorney jumped up instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is highly irregular. The petitioner cannot act as an impartial expert witness in her own civil dispute." Judge Harrison waved him down. "I will allow it, Counselor. This is an emergency motion regarding frozen federal assets, not a jury trial. I want to hear exactly what she has to say." "Proceed to the stand, young lady." I picked up the first black binder from the table and walked confidently to the witness box. The bailiff swore me in. I sat down, adjusted the microphone, and opened the heavy leather cover to the second tab. I did not look at Diane. I looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, 2 days ago I initiated a deep forensic audit of my late father's operational expenditure files. I began my voice steady and professional. I was looking for financial anomalies. What I found was a highly coordinated 12-year embezzlement scheme. Between the years of 2012 and the present day, exactly $5,240,000 was systematically drained from the private estate accounts." The courtroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel, demanding order. He leaned forward, his grim expression replaced by intense, sharp interest. "Explain the methodology of this theft," the judge commanded. "The funds were not taken in bulk," I explained, turning a page in my binder. "They were extracted using a banking evasion tactic known as smurfing. Every single month, wire transfers were executed in specific amounts just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold: $9,900, $9,800. These transfers bypassed IRS flagging systems and were routed directly to a numbered offshore intermediary account located in the Cayman Islands." Diane's lawyer shot to his feet, his face flushed red. "Objection. This is pure speculation. The petitioner is throwing wild accusations without providing a single shred of authenticated proof tying my client to these alleged offshore transfers." I calmly pulled a stack of printed bank statements from the binder and handed them to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. "Your Honor, those are the authenticated wire logs pulled directly from the estate servers," I stated. "You will see that every single flag transfer contains the digital authorization signature of the secondary estate overseer. That signature belongs exclusively to Diane." Diane's lawyer scrambled, grabbing his own copy of the documents Mitchell had just provided to the defense table. He flipped frantically through the pages, sweat forming on his brow. Judge Harrison reviewed the logs, his jaw tightening. "These transfers authorize millions to leave the country. Where did the money ultimately go?" "That brings us to tab 3, Your Honor," I said, maintaining my calm demeanor. I tracked the Cayman Island routing numbers back to their final domestic destinations. The money was funneled into 24 different limited liability companies registered in Nevada and Delaware. These include a property management firm and a logistics agency. I ran a federal corporate registry check on every single entity. None of them have employees. None of them file operational disclosures. They are textbook shell companies created solely to wash stolen money. And who is the registered owner of these shell companies? The judge asked, leaning over the heavy wooden bench. Every single shell company is registered to a man named Richard Hughes. I answered clearly. Diane's lawyer slammed his hands on the table. Objection. Irrelevant. Even if my client did transfer funds to this man, it was her husband's money and she had executive access. It could have been a legitimate private investment. I turned my head and finally looked directly at Diane. Her confident smile was completely gone. She was gripping the edge of the defense table so hard her knuckles were bone white. She knew what I was about to drop on her next. Before Judge Harrison could rule on the defense objection, Vanessa suddenly pushed her chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the shiny tile. She stood up, her face flushed with defensive anger, and pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "You are twisting everything!" Vanessa screamed, her voice echoing shrilly in the cavernous room. Mom had full executive authority over those operational accounts. She was well within her legal rights to freely gift that money to absolutely anyone she wanted. Richard Hughes was just a friend in need. It was a completely legal charitable gift, and you are just a jealous, bitter orphan trying to ruin our family. Diane's lead attorney frantically grabbed Vanessa's arm, trying to pull her back down into her seat. "Shut up!" he hissed through clenched teeth, realizing his client had just inadvertently admitted on the federal record that Diane did authorize the transfers. Diane buried her face in her hands, letting out a low, guttural moan. Judge Harrison banged his heavy wooden gavel. "Sit down immediately, young lady, or I will have the bailiff hold you in contempt of court," he bellowed. Vanessa collapsed back into her chair, hyperventilating. The judge turned his sharp gaze back to me. "The defense claims these transfers were legitimate gifts to a friend," the judge stated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Do you have evidence proving otherwise?" "I do, Your Honor," I replied calmly. The funds transferred to Richard Hughes were not a private investment, and they certainly were not a charitable gift. They were extortion payments. Richard Hughes was blackmailing my stepmother, and she was stealing from the estate to buy his absolute silence. Diane's lawyer stood up again, though he looked significantly less confident. "Blackmail. Your Honor, this is outrageous. What possible leverage could this random man have over my client to extort $5 million? I pulled a sealed envelope from the binder and handed it to the bailiff. "That brings us to the motive," I explained, looking directly at Vanessa. 2 days ago in the office of estate lawyer Mitchell, my stepmother and sister ambushed me with a paternity DNA test. They intended to use it to legally disinherit me, but the test results proved the exact opposite. The bailiff handed the envelope to Judge Harrison. The judge broke the seal and pulled out the laboratory results. "As you will see on the official lab report, Your Honor," I continued, my voice ringing clear and steady, "I am a 99.9% match to my late father. However, the secondary test subject, Vanessa, shows a 0% genetic match to the deceased." A fresh wave of gasps swept through the courtroom gallery. Vanessa froze, her mouth opening and closing in silent shock. She had completely forgotten about the DNA test in the wake of the massive financial scandal. Judge Harrison reviewed the paper, his brow furrowing deeply. "I see the results here," he said, looking down at Diane. "But how does this relate to the extortion payments made to Richard Hughes?" "Because, Your Honor, Richard Hughes is absolutely not just a random friend," I stated, pulling the very final piece of evidence from the heavy black binder. I handed the bailiff the high-resolution photographs of Diane's original tax returns from the 1980s. These are Diane's personal tax returns and banking statements from 1986, the exact year Vanessa was born. They were hidden in a cash-rented storage unit. They prove that decades before she met my father, Diane was already making massive structured payments to Richard Hughes. The judge examined the old tax returns, his expression hardening into pure ice. Richard Hughes is Vanessa's actual biological father. I announced the truth, hitting the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Diane has been paying him off for 35 years. When she ran out of her own money, she began using the offshore shell companies to siphon millions from my father's corporate empire. It was highly organized, illicit hush money, designed to keep her fraudulent life intact. Vanessa let out a horrific, piercing scream. She turned to her mother, grabbing Diane's shoulders and shaking her violently. "Tell me she is lying, Mom!" Vanessa shrieked, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "Tell me he is not my father. Tell me you did not steal that money for him." Diane did not look at her daughter. She stared blankly straight ahead, completely catatonic. The defense attorneys packed up their briefcases, slowly realizing they were fighting a completely unwinnable war in federal court. The blackmail was fully exposed. But I was not finished. There was still one final legal hurdle to clear. The prenuptial agreement was still sitting on the judge's desk, and I was about to rip it entirely to shreds. Diane suddenly snapped out of her catatonic state. She slammed her hands onto the defense table and pushed herself up to her feet. The polished veneer of the grieving widow was completely gone, replaced by the frantic rage of a cornered predator. "So what?" she screamed, her voice echoing wildly across the large courtroom. "So what if I paid him? It was my husband's money, and I was legally entitled to use it however I saw fit to protect my family." Her lead attorney tried to pull her back down, but she violently shoved his hand away. "You think you have won, Blair?" She spat, her eyes wide and manic. "You think a few unauthorized wire transfers are going to invalidate my prenuptial agreement? I am still the surviving spouse. I am the legal wife. That document on the judge's desk guarantees me 100% of the estate. You can try to send me to jail for fraud, but you will never see a single dime of that money because the prenup stands." She stood there, breathing heavily, completely convinced that her legal marriage was an impenetrable fortress. She banked on the fact that financial crimes do not automatically negate a marital contract executed decades prior. I looked at her, panting and red-faced, and felt a wave of absolute icy calm wash over me. "You are right, Diane," I said softly, speaking directly into the microphone so the entire room could hear every single syllable. "A financial crime does not automatically invalidate a prenuptial agreement. But you know what does: committing federal bigamy." The courtroom instantly plunged into a dead, stunned silence. Even Judge Harrison leaned back in his heavy leather chair, his eyebrows raised in sheer disbelief. I opened the very last folder inside my black binder. I reached inside and pulled out a single piece of paper. It was not a printed digital copy or a bank statement. It was a faded, yellowing document printed on thick official cardstock. The edges were slightly frayed from age, but the raised notary seal stamped in the bottom right corner was still perfectly intact. "Bailiff," I requested calmly, holding the fragile document out in the air. The armed officer walked over, took the paper from my hand, and carried it directly up to the high wooden bench. "Your Honor," I continued, my voice ringing with total authority, "what you are looking at is an official marriage certificate issued by Clark County, Nevada, exactly 41 years ago. It legally binds Diane to a man named Richard Hughes, the same Richard Hughes she has been funding with stolen estate money." Judge Harrison picked up the yellowed paper, adjusting his reading glasses. He read the text slowly, his expression shifting to absolute grim realization. "When Diane met my wealthy father, she saw an opportunity for a massive financial upgrade," I explained, turning to look at the terrified woman. But there was a problem. Richard Hughes was a convicted felon with a massive mountain of debt. If Diane filed for a legal divorce, the courts would have forced her to split his debts, and it would have created a public paper trail. A paper trail my father's lawyers would have easily found during a background check. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the devastating reality of the situation settle. So she never filed for divorce. She simply packed her bags, moved to Washington State, changed her last name, and pretended Richard Hughes was just a bad memory. She gambled that nobody would ever dig into the missing records of a Las Vegas shotgun wedding. Diane's knees finally buckled. She collapsed heavily into her wooden chair, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto the deck. Her lead defense attorney stared at her in sheer horror, realizing he was currently representing a woman who had lied about her fundamental marital status. He immediately took 3 very large physical steps away from the wooden defense table, intentionally distancing himself from the catastrophic perjury that was unspooling right before his eyes. Under federal and state law, I stated, looking right at Judge Harrison, you cannot be legally married to 2 different people at the exact same time. Because Diane never dissolved her first marriage to Richard Hughes, her marriage to my father was null and void from the very first day. It is a legal fiction. I pointed directly at the blue folio containing the prenuptial agreement resting on the judge's desk. Diane never divorced Richard. She has been committing bigamy for 4 decades. And because she was never legally my father's wife, that prenuptial agreement is entirely worthless. The massive financial empire she falsely claimed to own was now completely gone forever, leaving her with absolutely nothing but her own massive federal crimes. Judge Harrison held the faded yellow cardstock to the light, examining the raised notary seal. The silence in the federal courtroom was so profound I could actually hear the frantic ticking of Diane's diamond wristwatch across the aisle. The judge slowly lowered the certificate and removed his glasses. He looked directly at Diane's lead defense attorney, who was still actively backing away from his own client. Counselor Judge Harrison said, his voice carrying the dangerous weight of an impending storm. Have you ever seen this document before today? The high-priced corporate lawyer violently shook his head. Never, Your Honor. He stammered, his aggressive demeanor entirely vaporized. My firm was retained strictly for estate probate. My client explicitly assured us, under penalty of perjury, that she had no prior undissolved marriages. Had we known about this certificate, we would never have submitted the prenuptial agreement to this court. He looked at Diane with absolute professional disgust. I am formally withdrawing my representation, effective immediately, Your Honor. I cannot counsel a client who has actively engaged in perjury and fraud before this court. Diane grabbed the sleeve of his charcoal suit. You cannot leave me, she hissed. You work for me. I am paying you $1,000 an hour. The lawyer forcefully yanked his arm away. You do not have $1,000 to pay me, Diane, he replied coldly. He grabbed his briefcase and walked straight out of the courtroom, leaving her completely defenseless. Judge Harrison did not even reprimand the departing attorney. He turned his unforgiving gaze back to Diane. Under the federal and state laws of this country, bigamy is a severe offense, he declared, his voice booming through the room. A marriage cannot legally exist if one party is already bound to another living person. Therefore, your marriage to the deceased is officially declared void ab initio. It means it is legally void from the very beginning. You were never his wife. Diane let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white as snow. Please, Your Honor, she begged, her voice shrinking into a pathetic whimper. We lived together for decades. I cared for him. I hosted his dinners. I managed his household. I am entitled to something. I am his widow in the eyes of the entire world. You are a fraud in the eyes of the law. Judge Harrison fired back, his patience completely gone. He picked up the prenuptial agreement and held it up. This contract was executed under the explicit legal condition of a valid marriage. It grants assets to the surviving spouse. Because you are not a legal spouse, this contract is entirely invalidated. You have absolutely no legal standing to claim a single cent. You get nothing. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot, permanently sealing Diane's fate. The judge then turned his attention to Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Harrison ordered, his tone shifting to business. Given the invalidation of the marriage and the DNA evidence proving Vanessa is not a biological heir, the laws of intestate succession must be applied immediately. Who is the primary legal beneficiary of this estate? Mr. Mitchell stood up proudly, smoothing his tie. He did not stutter once. As the sole verified biological child of the deceased, my client Blair is the sole legal heir to the entire estate, Your Honor. The remaining liquid funds, the commercial properties, the family home, and the complete executive control of the charitable foundation all legally belong exclusively to her. Vanessa slumped forward, resting her head on the hard wooden table, and began to sob uncontrollably. The devastating reality was finally sinking into her spoiled mind. Her entire world of designer clothes, luxury cars, and exclusive country club memberships had just been completely wiped out in an instant. She was no longer a wealthy heiress. She was the daughter of a broke blackmailer and a convicted embezzler. She had absolutely nothing. Diane stared at me from across the aisle, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. She looked like she was rapidly aging 10 years in the span of 5 minutes. She had spent 35 years building a massive, intricate lie, meticulously stealing millions to cover her tracks, throwing me away like actual garbage to protect her toxic secret. And I had just dismantled her entire fraudulent life. The arrogant, untouchable country club queen was now a desperate broke woman sitting alone at a defense table. But her nightmare was still far from over. Because while she had just lost all of her stolen money and her social status, she was about to lose her freedom too. While Diane was still reeling from the complete invalidation of her marriage, the courtroom doors at the back of the gallery pushed open with a soft click. Donovan walked in, his face completely unreadable. He had slipped in quietly during the final moments of the hearing, dressed in a dark gray suit and carrying a single thick manila envelope. He did not look at me, and he did not look at Judge Harrison. He walked directly down the center aisle, completely ignoring the heavy tension that was still suffocating the room. Vanessa looked up from the wooden table, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of desperate relief when she saw her husband approaching. "Donnie," she cried out, reaching her shaking hands toward him. "Donnie, thank God you are here. You have to help me. Mom is losing everything, and the judge just invalidated the prenuptial agreement. You are a real estate attorney. You have to talk to him. You have to stop them from taking our inheritance." She actually thought he had come to rescue her. She still believed she was the victim in all of this. Donovan did not take her outstretched hands. He stopped in front of the defense table, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over his wife. He looked at her with a profound emptiness, as if he was staring at a complete stranger. "I am not here to help you, Vanessa," he said, his voice flat and perfectly calm. "I am here to serve you." He opened the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents securely bound with a blue legal cover. He dropped the heavy stack directly onto the wooden table right over Vanessa's folded hands. The loud slap of the paper against the wood made her flinch. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling as she stared down at the documents. "That is an emergency filing for absolute divorce," Donovan replied, his words cutting through the quiet courtroom like a scalpel. "And right underneath it is an emergency ex parte custody order signed by a family court judge at 8 o'clock this morning. I have been granted temporary full physical and legal custody of our children. You are legally required to vacate our family home by 5 o'clock this evening." Vanessa's eyes widened in sheer, absolute horror. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, scrambling to pick up the documents. "You cannot take my kids away from me. We can fix this, Donnie. We can hire better lawyers. We can fight Blair for the money. Or, there is no money," Vanessa Donovan said, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that was still loud enough for everyone to hear. "You spent our children's entire college fund paying off credit cards to buy designer bags, while your mother was stealing millions to pay off your biological father. I know everything. I recorded your little shredding party last night. I gave the audio file directly to the family court judge this morning. When the judge heard you actively conspiring to destroy federal bank records to cover up massive wire fraud, he did not hesitate to grant me full custody." Vanessa let out a horrific wail, burying her face in her hands. She finally realized that the nightmare was absolute. She had not just lost her inheritance. She had lost her husband, her home, and her children, all in the span of 10 minutes. Donovan turned his gaze to Diane, who was still staring blankly at the judge's bench. You destroyed your own daughter, Diane, he said, his voice filled with quiet disgust. You raised her to believe that money and lies could fix any problem. Well, look at her now. I hope your country club friends are ready to pay for her therapy because I am not giving her another single dime. Donovan did not wait for a response from either of them. He turned around, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked straight back up the center aisle. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors and disappeared into the hallway, entirely severing his ties to their toxic family forever. Judge Harrison watched the entire exchange with a stony expression before picking up his gavel one last time. This court is formally adjourned, he announced loudly. The petitioner, Blair, is granted immediate and full control of the estate assets. However, the respondents will remain seated. No one from the defense table is permitted to leave this room. Diane finally snapped out of her shock, looking up at the judge in sheer panic. What do you mean we cannot leave? She demanded, her voice cracking. The hearing is over. You took everything from me. What more do you want? Judge Harrison did not answer her. He simply looked toward the heavy oak doors at the side of the courtroom and gave a brief, firm nod to the bailiff standing nearby. The bailiff reached for the handle and pulled the door wide open. The final act of Diane's utter destruction had finally arrived, and it was wearing a dark suit and a federal badge. Two men walked through the heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom. They were dressed in identical dark navy suits with golden badges clipped securely to their belts. They moved with a terrifying sense of absolute purpose, their heavy leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished floorboards. They completely bypassed the wooden gate separating the gallery from the trial floor and walked straight toward the defense table. Diane stared at them, her chest heaving as she finally realized that the financial trap I had set for her went far beyond a simple civil probate dispute. Judge Harrison remained seated at the high wooden bench watching the agents approach. As I stated earlier, Diane, you are not dismissed, he said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. When the petitioner presented her forensic evidence to this court yesterday regarding the massive offshore wire transfers, my office immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Embezzling over $5 million through international banking channels is not just a family matter. It is a severe federal crime, and this court has zero tolerance for money laundering. The lead agent stopped right next to Diane's wooden chair. He was a tall, imposing man with a stern face and cold gray eyes. Diane Hughes, he said, intentionally using the last name from her secret first marriage. I am Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. We have been reviewing the certified forensic audit provided by your stepdaughter. The digital banking logs clearly show you systematically authorizing over 100 illegal wire transfers to offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands over a 12-year period. Because those stolen funds were routed across state lines into Nevada and funneled through international banking networks, your actions constitute multiple counts of felony. Federal wire fraud agent Miller continued, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet courtroom. Furthermore, you utilized domestic shell companies to hide the illicit funds tying you to a massive criminal conspiracy involving money laundering and extortion. A federal grand jury reviewed the emergency evidence this morning and immediately issued a warrant for your arrest. Diane pushed herself out of the chair, stumbling backward until her back hit the wooden railing of the gallery. No, she gasped, shaking her head frantically. No, this is a misunderstanding. I did not launder any money. My husband knew about those transfers. He authorized them. He told me to send that money to Richard. She was desperately grasping at straws, trying to drag my dead father into her massive criminal web. But nobody in the courtroom was buying her pathetic lies anymore. The absolute undeniable truth was already printed in black and white inside my forensic binders. Agent Miller did not entertain her desperate excuses. He stepped forward, grabbed her right arm, and twisted it behind her back. Diane let out a sharp cry of pain, but the agent was merciless. He reached to his tactical belt and pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs locking around her thin wrists echoed loudly through the courtroom. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. 35 years of arrogant manipulation, cruelty, and greed ended with the cold snap of federal steel. Mom, Vanessa screamed from her chair. She reached out toward Diane, but the second agent stepped in her path, holding up a warning hand. Stay back, ma'am, the second agent ordered. Your mother is currently in federal custody. If you interfere, you will be taken into custody for obstruction of justice. Vanessa froze her hands, trembling. She watched helplessly as the agents patted down her mother, confiscating her diamond jewelry and her watch. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Miller stated as he began marching Diane toward the exit doors. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a federal court of law. Diane was sobbing uncontrollably, now her hair falling into her face, her suit wrinkled and ruined. She looked back over her shoulder, locking eyes with me. Her arrogance was entirely gone. Only absolute terror remained. She knew she was never going to sleep in her mansion ever again. She would spend the rest of her life wearing a prison uniform. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, swallowing Diane entirely into the federal justice system. The vast courtroom was finally silent. Vanessa collapsed into her chair, weeping into her arms. She had no husband, no children, and no inheritance. Mr. Mitchell packed up his briefcase beside me, looking incredibly relieved. I stood up, buttoning my black suit jacket. I looked down at the empty table, feeling a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I promised my father the absolute truth, and I delivered today. 2 weeks passed since the heavy oak doors of the federal courtroom closed behind my stepmother. 2 weeks of aggressive legal restructuring and absolute silence from the people who had once made my life a living hell. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when I pulled my car into the familiar sweeping circular driveway of my childhood home. The massive green industrial dumpster was long gone. In its place sat a battered economy rental car with peeling paint and hubcaps covered in dirt. I parked right behind it, turning off the engine. A white county sheriff cruiser pulled up next to me, followed closely by a small white van belonging to a local locksmith. I stepped out of my car, breathing in the cold, fresh air. The sheriff deputy, a burly man with a thick mustache, walked over and checked his clipboard. You have the official eviction notice and the executed property deed, ma'am, he asked professionally. I handed him the heavy manila folder. He reviewed the documents, nodded sharply, and signaled for the locksmith to follow us up the brick front steps. I did not even bother knocking. I slid my key into the lock, but the door was already unlatched. I pushed it open and walked into the grand foyer. The house looked entirely different than it had just 14 days ago. It looked completely hollow. The expensive Persian rugs were rolled up, and the expensive artwork was gone, mostly sold off by Vanessa to pay for basic living expenses after Donovan froze their joint bank accounts. Vanessa was standing in the middle of the living room, wrestling a heavy designer suitcase toward the front door. She looked absolutely terrible. Her blonde hair was tied in a messy knot, her roots desperately needing a touch-up. She was wearing faded sweatpants and an oversized college sweatshirt, a far cry from the diamond-dripping heiress who had sneered at me from the country club VIP table. When she saw me walking in with a uniformed sheriff deputy, she froze, her face turning a pale shade of gray. Your time is officially up, Vanessa, I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any malice. The court gave you 14 days to vacate the premises. The deputy stepped forward, resting his hand comfortably on his utility belt. Mom, you need to take whatever you have packed and exit the property immediately, he instructed firmly. If you refuse to leave, I will have to escort you out in handcuffs. Vanessa did not yell or threaten me. The fight had been completely drained out of her. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with exhausted tears. Do you have any idea what you have done? She whispered, her voice cracking. Donovan took my kids. He will not even let me speak to them on the phone. Mom is sitting in a federal holding cell waiting for a trial she is definitely going to lose. I have absolutely zero money. I do not even have a place to sleep tonight. I stood there watching her cry. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. You did this to yourself, Vanessa, I replied quietly. You chose to fund a lavish lifestyle with money stolen from sick children. You chose to use a fake trust fund to commit mortgage fraud. You chose to throw my belongings into a dumpster and laugh about it. I did not ruin your life, I just handed you the bill. Now get out of my house." She swallowed hard, wiping her nose with the back of her sleeve. She grabbed the handle of her heavy suitcase and dragged it across the hardwood floor, the wheels squeaking loudly in the empty house. The deputy followed her outside, watching closely as she struggled to lift her expensive designer bags into the trunk of the cheap rental car. She slammed the trunk shut, got into the driver's seat, and drove slowly down the driveway without looking back. As the sound of her engine faded into the distance, the locksmith went to work drilling out the deadbolts on the front door and installing heavy-duty smart locks. I walked slowly through the empty living room, listening to the quiet, peaceful silence. I walked over to the grand marble fireplace. I opened my tote bag and reached inside, carefully pulling out the small wooden jewelry box belonging to my biological mother. I wiped a single speck of dust from the polished wood and placed it directly into the center of the mantel. It sat there perfectly, catching the morning sunlight streaming through the large bay windows. I did not need to gloat or celebrate. The house was finally mine. The ghosts of Diane's lies were completely gone, and I was finally standing on solid ground. A week after securing the house, I received a thick, certified envelope in the mail. The return address, printed in crisp black ink, bore the official seal of the State Accountancy Board. I sat at my new kitchen island, the morning sun warming the marble counter, and carefully sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Inside was a formal document printed on heavy embossed paper. The board directors had spent the last several days thoroughly reviewing the federal court transcripts and the massive FBI indictment handed down against Diane. The evidence of my innocence was absolute and undeniable. The letter contained a formal, unequivocal apology for my immediate suspension. The anonymous complaints filed by Diane's wealthy country club friends were officially classified as malicious perjury and referred to the state prosecutor for further action. My corporate forensic accounting license was fully reinstated with a pristine, unblemished record. The ink on the board letter was barely dry when my cell phone started buzzing. The caller ID displayed the name of the managing partner at my old downtown firm. I let it ring 3 times before finally pressing the green answer button. His tone was incredibly jovial, practically dripping with manufactured relief and forced camaraderie. He told me how thrilled the entire executive team was to hear the good news from the state board. He confidently offered me my senior position back immediately, acting as if nothing had happened. He even casually dangled the possibility of a junior partnership, trying to entice me to return to my old desk by Monday morning. I listened quietly to his practiced, corporate pitch while looking around my peaceful, sunlit kitchen. Just 2 weeks ago, those same executives had dragged me into a glass conference room, demanded my security badge, and stripped me of my livelihood without asking a single question. They had aggressively protected their corporate liability and thrown me directly to the wolves when I needed their support the most. I thanked the managing partner politely for his time, keeping my voice perfectly even and professional. Then I calmly informed him that I was officially tendering my permanent resignation. I hung up the phone before he could even process the rejection. I did not need their corporate ladder anymore. Thanks to the absolute invalidation of Diane's marriage and the enforcement of the original intestate laws, I had inherited massive liquid assets. The private estate funds were legally mine, and the family charitable foundation had been safely secured under the watchful eye of a strict federal trustee to ensure the grants reached the intended hospitals. I had the operational capital to do absolutely whatever I wanted. And looking at the cleared accountancy board letter sitting on my counter, I knew exactly what my next move was going to be. The very next morning, I signed a commercial lease for a beautiful, bright office space in the heart of downtown Seattle. It was smaller than my previous corporate firm, but it was entirely mine. I spent the next 2 weeks hiring a top-tier legal consultant and a small dedicated staff of junior financial investigators who possessed the same relentless drive for the truth that I did. Within a month, the heavy brass plaque on the front door was polished and mounted. It bore my name, followed by the words, independent forensic accounting and financial advocacy. I was no longer going to spend my days tracing illicit corporate funds for billion-dollar tech companies or hiding the tax mistakes of careless executives. I had found my true professional calling in the absolute wreckage of my own family. My new agency was strictly dedicated to a very specific and highly vulnerable clientele. We specialized exclusively in uncovering and prosecuting the financial abuse of the elderly by their own family members. I knew better than anyone how easily greedy relatives could manipulate the legal system to isolate and bankrupt an aging parent. I knew exactly how they used fake medical proxies, forged signatures, and emotional manipulation to quietly drain bank accounts while pretending to be devoted, loving caretakers. I knew how to spot the hidden offshore wire transfers, the smurfed cash withdrawals, and the sudden, unexplainable changes to living trusts. The wealthy elite of Seattle were full of women exactly like Diane. They were vicious financial predators hiding behind designer clothes, luxury cars, and country club smiles. I was going to make it my life's mission to hunt down every single one of them and hand their victims the exact same justice I had fought so hard to secure. On the morning of my grand opening, I stood behind my new, polished mahogany desk. The large floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, breathtaking view of the Seattle skyline. My father had taught me how to read my very first financial ledger when I was just 12 years old. He had used his wealth to quietly protect me from a monster under his own roof. Now I was going to use those same skills to protect other families from suffering the exact same fate. I sat down in my leather chair, opened my secure laptop, and welcomed my very first client. The first year of running my own agency flew by in an absolute blur of long nights and massive legal victories. Exactly 12 months after I welcomed that very first client, the relentless Seattle rain had finally given way to a bright, crisp spring morning. I parked my car near the tall iron gates of a peaceful coastal cemetery overlooking the deep blue waters of the Puget Sound. My father had explicitly wanted his ashes scattered over this exact body of water. Since Diane was no longer around to enforce her lavish country club rules, I had quietly fulfilled his final wish months ago. I had also purchased a simple, elegant granite headstone and placed it on a quiet, grassy hill facing the water, so I would always have a physical place to sit and talk with him. I walked slowly up the green hill, the morning breeze pulling gently at my trench coat. The past 12 months had been a whirlwind of absolute vindication. Diane was currently serving a 20-year sentence in a minimum security federal correctional facility. She had tried to negotiate a plea bargain, but the federal prosecution had zero incentive to offer leniency to a woman who had committed 4 decades of fraud and bigamy. Vanessa was completely cut off from the family wealth and her children. Donovan had secured full permanent physical custody and moved to a quiet suburb to give his kids a normal, healthy life. Vanessa was last seen working as a shift manager at a discount retail store, forced to finally learn the actual grueling value of a hard-earned dollar. The toxic empire they had built on my father's back was entirely erased from existence. I reached the crest of the hill and stood in front of the smooth granite marker. It simply read, "Theodore Hughes, beloved father, a man of quiet strength." I smiled, feeling a deep, profound sense of calm wash over me. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out a crisp white business card. The gold foil lettering of my agency caught the morning sunlight. I knelt down and tucked the card securely into the lush green grass right at the base of the headstone. "We did it, Dad," I whispered, the wind carrying my words out over the water. "We finally stopped the fire. You protected me when I was young, and now I am using your lessons to protect everyone else. I know you would be incredibly proud." I stood up and took a deep breath of the salty ocean air. For the first time in my entire life, the heavy, suffocating weight of my toxic family was completely gone. I turned away from the water and looked directly forward, speaking not just to the memory of my father, but to anyone who has ever felt trapped by the people who are supposed to love them. Society puts a massive amount of pressure on us to forgive and forget when it comes to blood relatives. We are constantly told that family is absolutely everything. We are told we must endure the manipulation, the lies, and the endless disrespect simply because we share the same genetics or the same last name. But the absolute truth is that blood does not automatically grant someone the right to destroy your peace. The concept of family is not a free pass for abuse. Over the last year, I have learned the beautiful, undeniable power of a chosen family. A chosen family is built on mutual respect, absolute honesty, and unconditional support. It is made up of the friends who stand by you when your world falls apart, the mentors who guide you, and the people who celebrate your victories without a single ounce of jealousy. By walking away from my stepmother and my sister, I did not lose my family. I lost a pair of emotional parasites. And in exchange, I gained my total freedom. I gained the absolute truth. I gained a quiet, peaceful life where I no longer have to constantly look over my shoulder or second-guess my own reality. It took a massive federal fraud case, a forged medical proxy, and a secret paternity test to finally sever the chains tying me to my abusers. But you do not need a dramatic courtroom battle to reclaim your own life. You just need the courage to draw a firm line in the sand and the strength to walk away when someone crosses it. You have to be willing to protect your own peace, even if it means letting go of the people you have known your entire life. Now I want to hear from all of you watching this. Toxic relatives rely entirely on your silence to maintain their control, but sharing your truth completely shatters their power. How did you finally establish firm boundaries with the toxic members of your own family? Did you cut them off completely, or did you find a way to keep them at a safe distance? Drop your stories and your advice in the comments below. Let us build a community that supports each other in choosing peace over toxic loyalty. Thank you so much for following my journey, and remember to always trust the numbers, because the truth will always set you free.